The words were said so casually that for a moment I thought I must have misheard them. We were standing in my kitchen, suitcases by the door, travel plans spread across the table, when someone chuckled and said, "You'll just slow us down." Just like that. As if I were a heavy bag nobody wanted to carry anymore. Then another voice added, "Why don't you stay here and water the plants while we're gone?" They laughed. Not cruelly, just comfortably. The way people laugh when they believe a decision has already been made. I nodded and even gave them a small smile. After all, when you get older, people assume you'll quietly accept whatever place they assign you. But later that night, when the house was silent and their car had long since disappeared down the street, I sat alone at the kitchen table and realized something that changed everything. If they truly believed I was too slow to keep up, then maybe it was time to show them exactly how far I could still go. My name is Harold Whitaker. I'm 73 years old, and until that evening I had spent most of my life believing family meant loyalty. The trip they were so eager to take without me was supposed to be a week in Arizona. Sedona first, then the Grand Canyon. My son Daniel had planned it months ago. His wife Melissa picked the hotels. My granddaughter Kayla printed the itinerary like it was some kind of corporate presentation. And me? I was the one who paid for half of it. That part never came up in the kitchen. When Daniel said I'd slow them down, he didn't even look ashamed. Just practical, like he was explaining a weather forecast. "Dad, it's a lot of hiking," he said, folding the map like the conversation was already finished. "Steep trails, long days." Melissa added softly, "We just don't want you getting hurt." Funny thing about concern, sometimes it sounds exactly like dismissal. I'd raised that boy in Columbus, Ohio. Worked 32 years in a tool factory so he could go to college. Paid his tuition when the scholarships fell short. Co-signed the loan for the house he lives in right now. And there he stood in my kitchen acting like I was some fragile neighbor who wandered in by mistake. After they left, I sat there a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The travel folder sat open on the table where Daniel had left it. 7 days, 4 cities, every reservation under his name, but the credit card attached to the bookings, well, that belonged to me. Around midnight, I stood up slowly, joints stiff, and walked to the hallway closet. Inside was the old suitcase I used back when my wife Eleanor was still alive. Brown leather, scratched corners. The handle wrapped in tape where it cracked sometime in the 90s. I hadn't used it in 15 years. I set it on the bed and opened it. If they thought I'd stay home watering plants, they didn't know me very well. Because by the time the sun came up over Columbus the next morning, I had already booked my own flight. Not to Arizona, somewhere else. And what I found waiting for me there was the reason my son didn't really want me on that trip in the first place. I didn't tell Daniel I was leaving. That was the first decision I made that felt different. For most of my life, I explained everything. Where I was going, why I was doing it, how it might affect everyone else. Old habit. When you raise a family, you spend decades arranging your life around other people's comfort. But that morning, standing in the airport in Columbus with my worn brown suitcase beside me, I realized something strange. No one had asked where I would be. Daniel and Melissa were already halfway to Arizona by then. I imagined them in their rental car, Melissa scrolling through restaurant reviews while Daniel complained about traffic outside Phoenix. I wondered if either of them had noticed I never texted good luck for the trip. Probably not. My flight wasn't until noon, so I sat near the window watching planes lift into the pale Ohio sky. The airport smelled like burnt coffee and floor polish. People hurried past with backpacks and rolling luggage, most of them young enough to move like their knees had never betrayed them. I took out my phone. 3 messages from Melissa in the family group chat. Photos of the desert highway. A cactus. Daniel grinning beside a gas pump. No message for me. That was fine, because my ticket didn't say Phoenix. It said Flagstaff, Arizona. See, when Daniel left that travel folder on the table, he forgot something important. Inside were the printed confirmations for every stop they planned to make. Sedona, the Grand Canyon, and a small hotel in Flagstaff on the third night. That last one caught my attention for a reason Daniel didn't realize. Because Flagstaff wasn't just a random stop on their trip. It was the town where my brother Walter died 22 years ago. A brother Daniel barely remembered. A brother our family almost never talked about. The boarding call interrupted my thoughts. I stood slowly, gripping the handle of my suitcase, and joined the line. 6 hours later, when the plane touched down in Arizona, the air outside the airport felt dry and thin. Pine trees lined the road beyond the parking lot, and the mountains in the distance looked darker than I expected. Flagstaff wasn't desert. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. I checked into a small roadside motel a mile from the train station. Nothing fancy. Just a narrow bed, a lamp with a crooked shade, and a window looking out toward the forest. I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the mattress. For a while, I just listened. The wind through the trees. A train horn somewhere far off. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the photograph I'd carried for years. 2 men standing beside a pickup truck. One of them was me. The other was Walter. He was smiling in that picture. The kind of smile people have when they believe life is still moving forward. Daniel thought I'd come to Arizona because I was stubborn. Too old to accept being left behind. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I came because the last time anyone in my family visited Flagstaff was the week Walter died. And there was something about that trip Daniel didn't know. Something I had kept quiet about for more than 2 decades. But the real trouble started the next afternoon, when Daniel and Melissa checked into the exact same hotel I had already booked. I didn't expect to see them that soon. Flagstaff isn't a big town, but the chances of us ending up in the same place still felt unlikely. Until it happened. The next afternoon, I walked into the hotel lobby Daniel had booked for the 3rd night of their trip. I arrived early on purpose. My knees needed the rest, and I figured I'd spend a quiet evening watching the mountains turn purple at sunset. The lobby smelled like pine cleaner and fresh coffee. A stone fireplace crackled against the far wall. I signed the register, thanked the young woman at the desk, and carried my suitcase slowly toward the elevator. That's when I heard Melissa's voice. "Daniel, I told you this place looked smaller in the pictures." I froze. Their voices drifted through the front doors just as they stepped inside, dragging 2 rolling suitcases and arguing the way married people do when they're tired of each other but still polite about it. Daniel looked older than I remembered from 2 days earlier. Sunburn across his nose. Sunglasses pushed into his hair. For a second, he didn't notice me. Then his eyes landed on my face. The color drained from him like someone had pulled a plug. "Dad?" Melissa stopped walking. Kayla looked between us, confused. I set my suitcase down beside my leg and gave a small nod. "Afternoon, Daniel." No one moved for a moment. The silence stretched long enough that the receptionist glanced up from her computer. Finally, Daniel walked toward me, his expression tightening with every step. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Not angry yet, just uneasy. "I'm traveling," I said simply. "You followed us?" The accusation landed heavier than he probably meant it to. "I had my own plans," I replied. Melissa crossed her arms. "This is really strange, Harold." That word. Strange, like I was some old man wandering into the wrong building. Daniel lowered his voice. "Dad, we talked about this." "No," I said quietly. "You talked. I listened." Kayla shifted awkwardly beside them, clearly wishing she was somewhere else. Daniel rubbed his forehead like he did when he was a boy trying to solve a math problem. "Look," he said finally, "if this is about what I said in the kitchen." "It isn't." That surprised him. Because the truth was, I hadn't come all this way to argue about hiking trails. I came for something else. Something buried in this town for 22 years. Daniel sighed and gestured toward the elevators. Well, we're staying here tonight. Since you're already here, I guess we can have dinner together. He tried to sound casual, but I noticed something in his eyes. Not annoyance, not embarrassment, fear. The kind of fear a man shows when something from the past suddenly walks into the room. And when we stepped into the elevator together, I finally understood why. Because Daniel wasn't just uncomfortable seeing me in Flagstaff. He was terrified I might visit the place we were both trying to avoid. Walter's grave. And the reason we never talked about how he actually died. Dinner that night was quiet. Too quiet for a family that used to argue over the last slice of pizza. The restaurant sat across the street from the hotel, a small place with wooden beams and dim yellow lights that made everyone look a little older than they were. Daniel insisted on paying, which was ironic considering I had paid for most of the trip they were on. We sat in a booth near the window. Melissa scrolled through her phone. Kayla picked at her fries. Daniel kept glancing at me like he was waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Finally, he said it. "So, how long are you staying in Flagstaff?" "Couple of days," I answered. He nodded slowly. Too slowly. Melissa looked up then. "Are you visiting someone?" The question hung in the air. I took a sip of coffee before answering. "Yes." Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Who?" he asked. "You know who?" For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. Kayla frowned. "Who are we talking about?" Daniel didn't answer her. His eyes were locked on mine now, tight with the same fear I saw in the elevator. "You can't be serious," he said quietly. "I am." Melissa leaned forward. "Harold, that was a long time ago." 22 years, I said. Daniel set his fork down harder than he meant to. "We agreed not to go digging into that again." I almost smiled at that word. Agreed. As if the silence after Walter died had been some kind of peaceful family decision. The truth was much uglier. "We didn't agree," I said. "You asked me not to talk about it." Kayla looked between us again. "Dad, what is going on?" Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. "Nothing," he muttered. "Just old family stuff." But Melissa was watching me now with a sharper expression. "You're going to the cemetery," she said. I nodded. "Tomorrow morning." Daniel pushed back slightly in the booth. "Dad, don't." The way he said it wasn't angry. It sounded desperate. "Why not?" I asked. "You know why." I leaned back and studied my son for a long moment. When Walter died, Daniel had been 24 years old. Old enough to remember everything. Old enough to understand what really happened that night outside Flagstaff. And old enough to help me keep the story buried. "You told everyone it was a hiking accident," I said quietly. Kayla's eyes widened. "A hiking accident?" she repeated. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's what it was." I shook my head slowly. "No, son." The waitress walked by just then, refilling our water glasses, completely unaware the air at our table had turned heavy enough to choke on. When she left, I leaned forward slightly. "Walter didn't fall," I said. Melissa went pale. Daniel stared at me like he wanted to stop the words before they reached the table. But it was too late, because the truth I'd kept quiet for 22 years was already on its way out. "Walter was running," I continued softly. "Running from you." Daniel didn't answer right away. For a long moment, he just stared at me across the table, his face stiff like a man trying to hold a door shut against something heavy. Kayla looked confused. "Running from Dad? What does that mean?" "No," Daniel said quickly. "It doesn't mean anything." But his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Melissa leaned forward slowly. "Harold, maybe this isn't the place." I shook my head. "This is exactly the place." Daniel's hand slammed softly against the table, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to make the glasses tremble. "Dad," he said through his teeth. "Stop!" I didn't raise my voice. "At my age, you don't need to." "Your Uncle Walter didn't fall off a trail," I said. Kayla stared at her father. Daniel looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. The memory came back as clear as if it were yesterday, 22 years earlier. Same town, same mountains. Walter had asked Daniel to take him hiking just outside Flagstaff. Nothing serious, just a quiet trail near the canyon ridge. I stayed behind at the motel that morning because my knees were already bad even then. They left before sunrise. When Daniel came back, he was alone. He told me Walter slipped near the ridge. Said it happened too fast to stop. Said he tried to grab him. I believed him. Or maybe I wanted to. But 2 days later, while Daniel was packing to leave Arizona, I found something in the glove compartment of the rental truck. A folded piece of paper. Walter's handwriting. I looked across the table at my son now. "You remember the letter?" I said quietly. Daniel's breathing had gone shallow. Melissa looked between us. "What letter?" Daniel didn't answer. So I did. "Walter wrote it the night before he died." Kayla whispered, "A letter about what?" I took a slow breath. "About money." That word landed like a dropped plate. Daniel's chair creaked as he shifted. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. But the strength had gone out of his voice. "Yes, I do," I replied. Walter had discovered something back then. Something about the business Daniel had just started. Loans, debts, investments that weren't exactly legal. Walter was the cautious one in our family, always careful with numbers. He had confronted Daniel the night before their hike, and the letter said one simple thing: Walter planned to tell me everything. Kayla's eyes moved slowly to her father. "Dad." Daniel rubbed his temples like the room had suddenly become too bright. "Walter was drunk," he muttered. "He was angry. He said things he didn't mean." "That's not what the letter said." Melissa looked at me carefully now. "Harold, where is that letter?" I held Daniel's gaze. "In my suitcase." Silence fell over the booth again. The waitress passed our table but didn't stop. Daniel stood up suddenly. The legs of his chair scraped the floor. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. For the first time that night, I saw something ugly flash across his face. Not guilt, panic. Because Daniel knew exactly what would happen if that letter ever saw daylight. And as he walked out of the restaurant without another word, Melissa whispered something that made the whole situation darker than I expected. She looked at me with wide, shaken eyes and said quietly, "Harold, Daniel told me he burned that letter 22 years ago." Daniel didn't come back to the table. We sat there for another 5 minutes after he left, the three of us staring at the empty chair like it might explain something if we looked long enough. Kayla finally spoke. "Mom, what's happening?" Melissa rubbed her temples the way Daniel had just done. "I don't know," she said quietly, but the truth was written all over her face. She knew more than she wanted to admit. I finished my coffee slowly and stood up. "I'm heading back to the hotel," I said. Kayla looked relieved. Melissa looked worried. But neither of them tried to stop me. Outside, the air in Flagstaff had turned cold. Mountain cold. The kind that creeps through your coat no matter how tightly you zip it. I walked across the street to the hotel, my knees aching with every step. Inside the lobby, the fireplace was still burning, and Daniel was sitting in the same chair he'd been in earlier that afternoon, waiting. He stood up the second he saw me. "Dad." His voice was low, tense. I set my suitcase down beside the chair and looked at him carefully. "You left dinner early." "You shouldn't have told them," he said. "I didn't tell them anything they shouldn't know." His jaw tightened. "You're digging up things that were buried for a reason." "No," I said calmly. "They were buried because you asked me to bury them." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps across the lobby carpet. "You don't understand what that letter actually meant." "Oh, I understand it perfectly." The fire popped in the fireplace behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel stopped pacing and looked at my suitcase. "Where is it?" he asked. "In there." "You brought it with you to Arizona." "I did." Daniel let out a slow breath. You kept it for 22 years. Yes. Another long silence. Finally, he said the one thing I'd been waiting to hear. You were never supposed to find it. There it was. Not denial, not anger. Just the truth slipping out because he was too tired to keep holding it back. You and Walter fought that morning, I said. Daniel looked down at the carpet. He was threatening to destroy everything I built. So you chased him. He ran, Daniel said quickly. I was trying to stop him. The words sounded rehearsed, old, like he'd been repeating them in his head for 2 decades. I leaned slightly on my cane. And when he reached the edge of that ridge? Daniel didn't answer. His breathing got heavier. Did you try to grab him? I asked quietly. Or did you push him? Daniel's eyes snapped up to mine. For a second, I saw something raw there. Fear. Real fear. But then something else replaced it. Something colder. You're an old man, Dad, he said softly. The words landed heavier than any shout. People forget things when they get older. I felt the weight of the sentence immediately. Not an insult. A strategy. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. You really want to go to the police with a story from 22 years ago? I said nothing. You really think anyone will believe a 73-year-old man with no proof? The fire crackled again. Daniel glanced at the suitcase once more. You should go home, he said. His voice was calm now, almost gentle. I'll book you a flight tomorrow morning. I studied my son's face for a long moment. The boy I raised in Ohio. The man standing in front of me now. And then I said something that made his composure crack for the first time. I'm not going to the police tomorrow. Daniel frowned. Then what are you doing? I picked up my suitcase. Tomorrow morning, I said. I'm going to Walter's grave. Daniel's expression went completely still, because there was one thing about Walter's grave that Daniel had hoped I would never discover. And tomorrow morning, I was finally going to see it for myself. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. At my age, sleep comes lightly. The body knows when something important is waiting. The motel room was still dark when I sat up on the edge of the bed. My suitcase stood against the wall where I'd left it the night before. For a long time, I just looked at it. Inside was the letter, Walter's handwriting. 22 years of silence folded into a single piece of paper. Outside, the sky over Flagstaff was turning pale gray. I dressed slowly, put on my coat, and slipped the letter into the inside pocket. Then I walked out into the cold. The cemetery sat on a hill just outside town. Pine trees surrounded it on all sides, tall and quiet, like they were guarding something. I reached Walter's grave just as the sun started touching the tops of the mountains. His headstone was simple. Walter James Whitaker, 1956 to 2004. Beloved brother. I stood there for a long moment. Morning, Walt, I said quietly. The wind moved through the trees. For 22 years I'd stayed away from this place. Because Daniel asked me to. Because I wanted to believe the story he told me. But something had bothered me about Walter's grave ever since the day it was buried. Something small, something no one else ever seemed to notice. I stepped closer. The headstone didn't face the canyon. It faced the road. Walter had loved that canyon. Spent hours sitting at the edge of it whenever we visited Arizona. If someone had asked him where he wanted to rest, I knew exactly what he would have chosen. The view, not the highway. I bent down slowly, brushing some pine needles away from the base of the stone, and that's when I saw it. A second marker, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't a headstone. It was a small brass plaque, probably placed there by someone who came back later. I wiped the dust off with my sleeve. There were only 6 words on it. Not Walter's name, not a date, just a message. My stomach turned as I read it. I didn't fall. For a long time, I couldn't move. The wind moved through the trees again, colder now. Someone had come here after the funeral, someone who knew the truth. And as I stood there staring at those 6 words, I heard tires on gravel behind me. A car door opened, then footsteps. Slow, careful. I didn't turn around, because I already knew who it was. Daniel's voice came from behind me, tight and low. "You should have stayed in Ohio, Dad." If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.